Welcome back to the channel. My name is Tronage, and today we're going to be talking about the Diatone MAMBA stack. That's an F4 flight controller and a 40 amp ESC 4-in-1 for $44? Stick around. Diatone MAMBA. That's what we're talking about today. So why are we talking about this? Well, essentially, I'm trying to get together all the parts that I feel are really a lot of bang for your buck. I'm trying to put together what I'm going to call the Tronage budget build, or the TBB quad, that contains all the parts that are really sourced out, that are not, they don't leave you hanging, they just really deliver, and they have a lot of bang for the dollar. And the Diatone MAMBA F4 stack is 100% ticks all the boxes for being one of those items to be included in this stack. Just to, wrap your head around, it's an F4 flight controller with OSD, all kinds of goodies on the flight controller, and it's a 40 amp 4-in-1 ESC, and it's not all on one giant board that's hard to put into your quad. It's a standard stack. You have your 4-in-1 ESC, you have your flight controller, mounted to each other with little wires running between them, and it was only $44, $43.99 if you want to be very specific. That's insane that they're offering it at that kind of a price point. Separately, I think they're like $30 or $35 each. So the flight controller is like $30 or $35, and the ESC is a $30 or $35. So you're talking, it's about $60 or $70 to buy them separately. But you put them together in a box, oh, they'll just charge $44. That's crazy value. And the Diatone flight controller is a great flight controller. The ESC is amazing. So let's dig in and let's talk about this. So what we'll do, you're going to come in, we're going to do a little bit of an unboxing. We'll go through what is included, how it hooks up, what pins you're going to be using, and then we'll just talk about it for a little while, all right? So why don't you come on in, let's crack it open. So here we have it, the Diatone MAMBA stack, and this packaging has got me very intrigued, it being in this little round box and everything, so I'm really excited to crack this open. So let's crack the seal and see what we got inside. So, comes off, we got a little piece of paper in the lid, and then we have a little piece of foam covering the top. So far the presentation is pretty darn cool. Here's our stack, so let's just pull that out. Whoa. That looks very clean. Very cool. Wow. I am very impressed with that already. Just the way the board is even laid out looks really cool. But we'll get into that. Let's put that aside for now. Let's see what else we get in the box. Little piece of foam. We have a little, I don't want to rip that. I'm going to pull this. Okay, this is like a little collar around the edge if you're interested about that information. Now I pull this out. This, I guess that's the manual. All right, so we'll talk about that in a minute. And then this kind of came apart. They have a little piece of foam with little dividers in it. And then there's your goodies. And then another piece of foam. And then the bottom with the information. And that's very cool. So we'll go over the stats in a moment when we talk about the board. All right, so let's talk about the goodies you get first, and let's bring the board back in here so we can see where these would apply. So the first thing they give you is they give you a spare one of these connectors that run from the ESC and the flight controller, which is pretty cool because if you think about it, if this ends up getting damaged or whatever, or something happens, you wouldn't have a spare one. It'd be hard to source one. So you just have a little spare one, so they thought you out in case you run into a problem. They got you covered, which is pretty cool. The next thing that they've given you a XT60 connector in black, which is really cool. I like that a little bit better than the yellow ones. And the other thing I'm noticing is where you'd put the wire, these brass connectors to solder to, They're a little bit thinner, so they'll be a little bit easier to heat up and solder to, so that's a nice touch. And they've even given you an itty bitty bundle of wire so you can make your little power connector if you didn't happen to have a little higher gauge wire on you. They give you the wire with the tin tips ready to go. You just solder one end to your XT60 connector, solder the other end to your stack here, and you're good to go. The last thing they gave you is one of these, I think they're called a low ESR or whatever. They're basically like really high efficient capacitors that are used for helping in filtration. And my opinion is, when a manufacturer gives you a piece in the box, it's not an optional piece. It means you need to use this when building your craft. So my guess is going to be, if we flip this over, just to take a little side trip, if we flip this over and look at the ESC, and I'm going to take a peek down the middle. Yes. Okay, so the reason why they've given you this is because this ESC does not have much onboard filtration. Filtration comes in the form of a capacitor. That's what this is a capacitor. The capacitors on this board are these little square things here. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and there's one here, 9, 10. 10, maybe a little one there. I don't know if that's going to be part of the filtration or just part of something else. But these big bulkier ones, those are going to be part of the filtration system for this ESC. And there's very few of them on this board. That means that each ESC probably has like 2 or 3 is the idea here. Basically, these are the capacitors that are used for filtration on your ESC. And there's very few of them. Typically, an ESC has a lot more than like 2 or 3 of these per ESC. So that's why they've included a large capacitor, because what they've done is, since they've crammed so much goodness into this one board, there probably wasn't enough room to put the onboard ESC, so they've given you an external ESC to solder onto. If you're not aware, basically you just put this in line with your power cable. So your power would solder up to your ESC right on these 2 pads. You got your positive, you got your negative, and what you would do is you would put this capacitor on the same spot. And when in doubt, you look at the capacitor. The side that has this bar, that's going to be your negative lead. That's so you know which end to put to negative. This side's going to be your positive. Your positive lead would also be a little bit longer. And you're going to hook those up. You're just going to solder those 2 wires to those 2 pads along with your power connector coming in. So that's how you use this. 470 microfarad capacitor, 35 volt Sanyo. So that's our ESC. So now let's take a look at this board in general from our first looks here. Very clean, very well laid out. What I'm also liking is they've actually soft mounted the ESCs right here with a little O-ring. And what's nice about that is because any vibrations that make it past here can still get absorbed by the soft mounting that they have up here on the flight controller. So it's actually double soft mounted. You have your first line of defense and then your second line of defense, which is nice. It's a nice touch they've done there that, you know, helps isolate those vibrations and helps your craft fly even better out of the box without even having to do anything, because you can just stick this in your craft, bolt it down, solder to it, and you're done. You don't even have to do anything with it. So that's really cool that they've done that. So back to the ESC, let's take a look here. We got our motor pads here, so 1, 2, 3 for each of the motors as you go around the thing. And what's nice is that they don't have those little tabs out. I mean, yes, the tabs are probably a lot easier to solder to, but they stick out. And these are nice that they've kind of tucked them in, and I guess that's probably why they also opted for the external capacitor, because if these solder pads were sticking out as those little like pegs, then they'd have more room to put the capacitors, but they forego that and put the solder pads on the inside, and I feel like that lets you have a little bit cleaner of a build when you're soldering this up. But it does mean you have to be a little bit careful and you don't end up soldering into some of these other things that are around those pads, so just take care when you're doing that. It looks like we also have onboard current sensing, which is pretty cool, and yeah, that's looking like that's gonna be a freaking awesome ESC. To get that information wired up to your flight controller, it comes with a little cable pre-installed, ready to go. So you don't need to run any wires from your flight controller to your ESC. That's what this is taking care of. So when you attach your battery leads, they're gonna go right to your ESC here. It's gonna power up your flight controller. It's going to do all the communications between the ESCs and the flight controller, so you don't have to worry about any of that. It's already taken care for you, which is really awesome. Now, let's talk about some of the stats on this ESC. According to the documentation here, it's a F40 4-in-1 ESC. Its input can take 4 to 6 S packs, which is 12.6 to 25 volt. It's 40 amps per 4, so 40 amps per ESC. Its burst current is 50 amps. It has a BEC on here, which is your battery elimination circuit, for 5 volts, 1.5 amps. It is, the software it runs is D-Shot, which is, it'll do D-Shot 150, 300, and 600. And its mounting is the 30 by 30 standard hole pattern. And it uses M3 screws, which is incredible. Those are some amazing stats to have on such a affordable, cheap little stack for your 4-in-1 ESC. 40 amps. 40 amps. That's, you know, usually for something this cheap, you'd be like at 20, 25 amps. It's 40 amps per motor. You can put some really nice stuff on attached to this. All right, so now let's talk this flight controller on the top. Let's go over its stats from the package here. It says it's an F405 flight controller. Its processor is an STM32 F405. The gyro on it is an MPU 6000. It has 16 megs of onboard flash. It has an OSD Betaflight. It has the battery elimination circuit of 5 volts, 1.5 amps, and its weight is 19.6 grams. But we will check that. In fact, while we're talking about weight, let's check that right now. Get my scale, turn it on. So we're at 20 grams. They're calling it 19.6, and I would believe it because I don't think this scale can do less than a gram. So 19.6 would round to 20, so they're not lying on their packaging. It is a 20 gram stack, which is, and that's including all the hardware and the standoffs and the wire running between them. It's as is 20 grams, which is great that they actually list it on their packaging as the actual weight. Some of them may try to, you know, make it sound like it's a lighter stack by only weighing the boards themselves, not counting the hardware, not counting the wires running between them, but as is 20 grams and you're out the door. All right, so now let's talk about what these pins are and how you'd hook this up, and let's go around this and just talk about it in general. So first, we see this little arrow that's silk screen here that's telling me that this is the front of the flight controller. So if you're going to put this in a standard setup and you don't want to have to mess around with anything, you just make sure that this arrow is pointing forward, so your camera would be here and you're good to go. Now it does come with a little manual here, so let's open this up and take a look at it. And it's a very simple manual that basically has no word, well, it has some words, but it's basically just telling you where to hook up each thing, and it's showing you the colored wires that would go to each of those things so you know where they go. But we'll go through it together. So let's start here. Why not? So what we got here, this is going to be our LED section. What we have is our, we have our ground pin. We have our 5 volt pin, and then we have our signal wire for our LEDs. Okay, so over here, we have our video transmitter section. So we have our 5 volt pin, we have our ground pin, we have our TX3 pin. This is what you're gonna use for if you're using smart audio. That's where you would come in with that. And you have your vid pin. Vid pin is gonna be your video out, the output of the flight controller's video with the OSD already laid on to go to your video transmitter. Now, if your video transmitter does not take 5 volts, let's say it takes like 7 point something volts or higher, and you don't have it here, what you can do is you can grab it from over here. Your VCC is going to be your full battery voltage, because remember, this pin should be connected to the full battery voltage that's coming from the lower portion on the ESC. So if you need full battery voltage, you should be able to grab it right here from this VCC pin. So if your video transmitter needs more than 5 volts, just put it over here. Moving around the board, this is the section where you're going to be attaching with your ESC below it. But let's say you didn't get an ESC that was made by Diatone and you're not using this actual connector. Right below this connector, underneath, there's actually some pins. I'll pop this off real quick so you can see. There's a set of pins that you can see underneath there. And those pins correspond to the different motor wires and stuff that would go to the ESC right here. Let's see if I can show you this a little bit better. There we go. So these pins here, and they are still screened and labeled on the underside of this board. So if you do need to, if you buy this separately and you're looking for that information, they're right on your board, and it just tells you which pins go to which motor outputs. And then moving around to here, we have the section that would be for our camera, which makes a lot of sense because our camera should be here in the front of the craft. So our pins we have are the camera in, which would be our video in pin here. We have our ground pin. We have our 5-volt pin to power the camera with. And then we also have a buzzer, positive and negative, so we can hook up a buzzer to this too, which is great. I'm a big fan of buzzers just because, you know, you lose your quad in tall grass, you're going to wish you had a buzzer, and there's a spot right there to put it, which is great. Then moving around here, they have their receiver section of their pads. So they have your ground, you have your 5-volt, you have your PPM if that's what you're using for your receiver. You have your RX1 and your TX1 here. And then you have your 3-volt pin. So the 3-volt pin would be if you're using like a Spectrum satellite receiver. They require 3.3 volts in. That's what you're going to use to power it. Otherwise, if your receiver uses 5 volts, then you just use a 5-volt pin. So this is where you're going to hook up your Free Sky, you're going to be hooking up your S-Bus, you're going to be hooking up your Crossfire, you're going to be hooking up your Spectrum. They're all going to go over onto these pins. Now, moving along, well, while we're on the topic of this, if you're using, like, let's say iBus, because these are inverted, if you're going to be using something that's using iBus, then as a little fast forward, you're going to be wanting to be over here, but more about that in a minute for how to hook up your receiver. Then moving along here, we have 2 pins here which say SCL, and I can't read the other one, SDA, I believe. These are for if you're using a GPS that has a compass on it, then you can, these are the pins for the compass, so the flight controller can read that compass data. Probably won't be using it, but that's kind of nifty that it's on this flight controller too. So if you want to put a little GPS module on here also, it has the pads for the compass portion as well, so you know which way you're facing while flying. That's pretty nifty. As we mentioned earlier, these are your, if you weren't using the 4-in-1 ESC below it, these are where you could solder your power for your battery, so to just power up the board if you wanted to. But primarily you'd be running that, but usually you'd have that coming in from a power distribution board if you were not using a 4-in-1 ESC. So your power would go onto the power distribution board, and then you'd have one set of leads coming from there up into your flight controller, and they would attach here. But in the configuration that's pictured here, our power is going to be down on the 4-in-1 ESC, and these are just going to act like another ground and a basically full battery voltage pin that we can grab if we need for like our VTX or some other thing that we need full battery voltage for. Okay, so then we move on to this bottom section here, which I'm going to be basically call the miscellaneous section. What it is it's 2 additional UARTs to hook stuff up to. We have the ground and 5-volt for UART 3, so we have TX3 and RX3. And then we have a ground and a 5-volt for UART 6, so we have TX6 and RX6. So a couple things to keep in mind here. First of all, if you're not using your receiver over here because you have like iBus, let's say, and you're going to hook up over here, keep in mind that if you're using telemetry on your iBus, then you're going to be using TX3, RX3, and the ground and the 5-volt, which is fine and dandy. But if you also want to use smart audio and you hooked up over here, this is also TX3 for smart audio. So keep in mind, this is TX3, this is TX3. There's also a TX6 over here, and there's a TX6 over here. So keep in mind that just because they're separate pins, they are the same. So if you are using smart audio on your UART 3, then if you're going to hook up an iBus receiver, throw it on the TX6, throw it on UART 6, because 3 you're going to already be using over here. Or if you want to use your UART 3 over here, that's fine. Just make sure you don't hook up smart audio on TX3. Use TX6 then if that makes you happy. There's no real rules or rhyme or reason, but just remember, if you're going to be using a receiver that has telemetry on it so that it's going to be communicating with your flight controller, you're going to be needing to use both the RX and the TX pins. So UART 3 is set up over here for smart audio. So I would say use UART 6 for your receiver if you need to have a non-inverted signal. Primarily though, I feel a lot of people, mostly myself included, we'll be using the pins over here. So that is really well laid out, and I'm really liking the way they've just set up this board, and it's really easy to hook up to, really easy to solder to, and it's not very complicated. Everything's pretty much laid out, and if you get confused, you just refer to this. And, you know, obviously they don't talk about these two UARTs down here, but if you're using these UARTs, you're probably in a little bit of a different class of person, and you know roughly what you're doing. But if you're just using, like right here, they have a Free Sky receiver pictured. If you're just plugging into that and you're going to be using your inverted signal, you just hook up like that, off you go, and there's no conflicts because you're not going to be on. This is TX&R X1, this is TX3 for your smart audio. Everything's good to go. So this is your little bonus section for if you have additional things you wanted to hook up. Also, that's where you would hook up if you had your GPS unit. Like I mentioned, this is where your compass portion would be hooking up, but you also need to put an input and an output onto a UART. And again, that would go over here. Now, if what I'm talking about is confusing you and you don't really get what I'm talking about, that is absolutely okay, because like I said, this will be included in my Tronage budget build. And when I go to install it, I'll cover what wires go where and how it hooks up and all that fun stuff in further detail. But ultimately, this is a great flight controller, especially for the value and the dollar that it costs. So ultimately, the reason why this is making it into the Tronage budget build parts list is because of the absolute value that it has. It's a 40 amp ESC 4-in-1 with an F4 flight controller, smart audio, OSD. It's got 16 megabytes of flash for black box. It's got everything on it. I mean, there's nothing really that I would want out of it that's not on it already. So, and I just cannot believe $44 for the whole stack at 40 amps for ESCs. I mean, that's ridiculous. I don't think you can even, I mean, the ESC, the 4-in-1 ESC that's included here is already like $30 or $35. So, whichever way you look at it, you're getting the other board for like half price. So it's like basically buy one, get one half price style with this thing. And even if you look at the Racer Star, I think it's like a 30 amp, maybe all in one. It's like one giant board that has the flight controller and the ESCs all together in one board. Keep in mind with something along those lines. If your flight controller and your ESC are on the same board and something goes wrong with your ESC, you're blowing out the whole thing and you have to replace the whole thing. The beauty of this is it's a stack. It's a standard stack. So if something goes wrong with your ESCs, you can replace the ESCs. If something goes wrong with your flight controller, you can replace the flight controller. They're independent of each other because they're in a stack formation. It's also very standardized. It fits in anything that needs a standard stack. So that you can work this into very tight builds because in theory, this is everything that would be in your stack. If you're trying to do a very minimalistic build, and you don't want to put anything else in your stack, that's it. That's your whole height. And in fact, let's get a little height action measurement on this while we have it in our hands here. The total height, let's do maximum height. So I guess I'm going to run it right across here where the connector is and where the hardware is. I'm just going to measure that whole height right here is 18.69, so let's call it just shy of 19 if you want to count the entire thing. Now there's a little bit, if you use a smaller standoff, you could probably get it a little bit tighter. There is some room to be had, but out of the box, this is what we're looking at. So if you wanted a really tight build, this could be your center stack, and then you just take your receiver and your video transmitter and put them, you know, maybe in a tail section of the frame, and then your camera will be up in the front and you're good to go. So the fact that you can cram this all into this little space ready to go out of the box for 44 bucks, I mean, how is that not in the budget build? I mean, yeah, I mean, come on, even just, I don't know. I don't know how they do it, and I don't know why it's so cheap, and I don't know why everyone's not grabbing like 10 of these, because that's why it's in my build. You got a quality product, quality ESC, quality flight controller with everything. I mean, come on, you're in a budget build and you're getting all these features, OSDs and smart audio and 40 amps. You know what kind of motors you can hook up to this with 40 amp ESCs on here? I mean, you're gonna be kicking butt. All right. So I hope it helped you out. I love this ESC. I hope I got you some information you may or may not have known. And like I mentioned, we will be building this out into a future build, so you'll see exactly how it gets wired up. We'll do some flight tests and just, you know, check it out entirely. But for now, I'm really pumped about this product. So as always, my name is Tronage. Fly strong.